mean, look at this thing. And today's the day, because I found an adorable bunny. Since this will be a mixed media mosaic, the materials, also known as Tesserae, which I'll be using, can include all sorts of stuff. So I got started by pulling out my storage containers of broken plates, bowls, and cups in white and off-white. Lately, I've been a bit obsessed with the color combination, and I knew it was exactly what I wanted for this bunny. There's no rhyme or reason in my Tesserae placement. I'm trying to spread out the mix of white and off-white pieces. I'm just tiling and enjoying myself. There's an organized tiling pattern and a freestyle tiling pattern, and I like that both can equally coexist on this mosaic. A lot of that can be contributed to me using the same color palette for the entire mosaic. With a size like this, I could see it on a patio, like on a little table, or down on the ground next to maybe a trio of some flower pots. It could go on your Easter brunch table. That could be the centerpiece, or your coffee table. Let's get to it. Welcome back, and if you're new here, my name is Julie, and on this channel we talk about tips, tricks, tools, adhesives, materials, and specific mosaic projects, all to shorten your learning curve when it comes to creating mosaic art. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, please consider subscribing. There's something about having a figure or statue in a garden. It feels like a luxury. Growing up here in Miami, I can remember what we would now consider an old Florida home. They would have these small little intimate gardens that they had created. Nothing elaborate, but they were full of charm. And they would usually include a statue or a couple statues or figures, and of course, a bird bath. Having these things, these figures in the garden just seemed like the finishing touch to an already thriving and beautiful outdoor space. But I can never remember any of those garden figures being covered in mosaic art. They were usually unpainted cement, which in and of itself can be beautiful. And yes, I loved gardens, and even at the ripe old age of about 7 or 8, I would judge people by their gardens. What did they have growing in the gardens? And did they have a statue or figurine? Did they have a bird bath? And bonus points if they had a water feature and a bridge. And maybe some paths going through the garden. I was very picky. I've done a mosaic stepping stone video here on my channel. If you haven't seen it yet, I'll include a link to it down below in the description. But I haven't done a garden figure video until today. So I knew it was just a matter of time before I found a cement substrate that I wanted to mosaic. And today's the day, because I found an adorable bunny that of course is perfect for spring and Easter, which is the season we're in right now at the time of filming this, but it's also the perfect size if you don't want too big of a commitment, or maybe you're just getting started in mosaic making. I'll include a link down below in the description for the substrate that I'll be working with in today's video, plus some other cement bunnies which I also thought were cute, plus everything that I'm using in today's video. I will try to link as much of that as possible. So in today's video, we'll tile and grout a cement bunny garden figure with mixed media mosaic. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. Before we go over the Tesserae and start the tiling, let's first talk about the cement substrate. Now, this is a typical gray cement, and what you probably noticed initially is that it's a very plain substrate. Some might even say it's a modern bunny. There aren't any fine details. There's a little indentation on either side of the head for the bunny's eyes, but that's pretty much it. Now, whether the substrate has a lot of details or not, it doesn't matter when it comes to tiling it. So I can either get really detailed in my tile work, basically creating features, or I can keep my intentions more relaxed. And to finish things off, of course, there's a cute cottontail on the back. Let's move on and talk about the materials I'll be using in this video. Since this will be a mixed media mosaic, the materials, also known as Tesserae, which I'll be using can include all sorts of stuff. So I got started by pulling out my storage containers of broken plates, bowls, and cups in white and off-white. Lately, I've been a bit obsessed with the color combination, and I knew it was exactly what I wanted for this bunny. Next, I went into one of my storage containers with 1-inch square glass tiles on mesh and started pulling what I needed. I also pulled some different shades of white vitreous glass tile as well. So here's what I'm going to be working with. You'll also see here that I have white ceramic circles, although I'm not quite sure if I'm going to be using those or not, as well as something that's called back stamps, which I cut from the backs of plates, bowls, and cups. Now, talk about being obsessed. I know for sure that I want to include a bunch of back stamps on this bunny. But like I said a moment ago, this is a nice assortment of materials to work with. You know, I'm not sure I'm going to be using it all, but I'd rather have more than have too little. Now, mind you, at this point, I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to mosaic the bunny, and this is what I love about mosaic art. In moments like this, where I don't have a clear design in mind, I let the materials or tesserae basically guide me or speak to me. And I know that sounds very woo-woo, but sometimes I let the design guide me by how easy or difficult the materials or tesserae are to cut. I hadn't started tiling yet and realized I also wanted to pull some stained glass into the mix and decided to cut some pieces into strips because the design was starting to come together in my head. The tesserae were guiding me, or the tesserae were speaking to me. I love that. And then I got started cutting the vitreous glass tile down into pieces using my wheeled glass nippers and made them the same width as the stained glass strips. And next, I also cleaned up the back stamps a little bit more, again, using my wheeled glass nippers. This is what I like to call tightening up the white space around the writing, whenever possible or necessary, so that the outline or overall shape of the piece looks neater. I made reference a little earlier to the size of the ears of this garden figure and how I liked how big they were. Of course they are, it's a bunny. But I was glad with their size because I want to add pink to the insides. So I went dumpster diving into my Tesserae stash. Now, if you've watched other tutorials here on my channel, then you know I'm always encouraging you to save your cutoffs because you just never know when you're going to need them, no matter how small. So I went through the container of my cutoffs, which I now keep grouped together by color, and found the pink bag. The ceramic and glass pieces are basically the same thickness, which will make tiling easier. And that's all of the prep work that I did to the tesserae to get them ready for tiling. And yes, I will need to cut down these pieces more as I start tiling my substrate, but just to get me started, I knew I wanted to cut some things down ahead of time because of the design I was going to start with. Now, before we can start tiling this substrate, there are a couple other little details that we need to talk about. I decided to draw a guide within the ears for the pink tesserae. I also wanted to include eyes on the bunny, and I could have easily not had eyes on the bunny, but I wanted him to have eyes, so I penciled on some guides within the indentations in the cement. Now for the adhesive, I'm going to use white fortified thinset. If you're shopping for thinset, look for the word fortified or words polymer modified, and I'll include a link in the list below in the description if you're unsure what you're shopping for. And I mixed it up in a freezer zipper bag, which not only keeps the air from it, but also, as you'll see once we dive into tiling, it just makes applying the adhesive to a substrate like this so much easier and quicker. So while the thinset is going through its chemical reaction for a few minutes, I started working on the bunny's eyes. Now I have these small round glass tiles, and I found some pieces of dark brown stained glass in my materials cut-off stash. And so with a Sharpie, I'm drawing lines to create cut marks on the brown stained glass. These pieces of glass will be on opposite sides of the black round, like eyeball, what I'm going to call the eyeball glass. And once I was happy with the size, I got to work with cutting the Tesserae with my wheeled glass nippers, and I did need to make a few fine or minor adjustments. And then once they're ready to go, we're ready to tile. Now I started by adhering the eyes into the indentations of the substrate, but what I discovered was that the indentations aren't symmetrical. They're not in the same exact spot on each side of the bunny's head. So I made sure that the eyes were placed properly regardless of where the indentations are. Now it won't look odd or out of sorts once the rest of the head is tiled. But I wanted you to be aware that you can't necessarily go by the fine details on your substrate. You still need to be aware and use your judgment for Tesserae placement. So next I got to work with tiling the ears. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted the ears to be a mix of materials in pink. So I'm working with a mix of different types of glass tile. There's some stained glass, some ceramic tile, and glass rods. And as I'm tiling, I'm trying to keep the Tesserae all at the same level on the surface of the mosaic, so a few of the pieces needed to be built up with the thinset. Now, if you're curious how to tile a mosaic, which includes Tesserae of different thicknesses, I've done a video all about this topic, and I'll include a link to that video down below in the description. And once I was done with the first ear, I flipped the bunny over and propped it up by using my tiled nippers under it. Hey, you know, we're inventive. This is just so that I can keep the tiled ear off of the table while the thinset dries and sets a bit more. And on this side, I tiled the inside of the ear in the same exact way as I did the first side, using all of the same materials. So having the pencil guides on the inside of the ears was super helpful in keeping the pink Tesserae contained in that area. And I also want to make sure that when it comes time to tile the outside part of those ears, that there will be plenty of contrasting color surrounding the pink when you're looking at the bunny straight on. Now, because I'm not going to tile the outside area of the ears right now, I made sure that I cleaned up any thinset that may have oozed out and over that pencil guide. So I did this because thinset is a cement-based adhesive, and if it oozes out and it was a mess all over the substrate, it would make it very difficult to get a tessera from one tiling session up close to a tessera from a later tiling session. So I cleaned up the area now while it's still wet and very much workable. And here we are with eyes and pinks in the ears. I'm liking it so far. Next up, I'm going to start tiling the bunny's head. Now, my vision for the bunny is to have a structured look on its head and a more loose tile design on the body. So I got to work placing rows of glass tile. I started with a row of stained glass pieces, basically in the center of the bunny's head, but no, I didn't measure it exactly. And then I flanked each side of this first row of stained glass with pieces of cut vitreous glass tile. Now, I have 3 different colors of white vitreous tile that I'll be using on the bunny's head. The difference in colors of white are slight, which is precisely the look that I'm going for. And I continued this design of a row of white stained glass and then a row of white vitreous glass, so that both sides of the bunny's head, when you're looking at it from the front, are symmetrical in materials used. Next, I wanted to include or pull glass down onto the body a little bit, pull that glass design or that glass usage down the body just a little bit to tie the head and the body designs together. So I placed a few squares of 3/4 inch vitreous glass tile down the front of the bunny's body. And then I cut smaller strips of 1 inch glass tile and placed them in between the squares of 3/4 inch vitreous glass tile. Next, I put the bunny up on a pottery wheel, which allowed me to work on the bunny without picking it up and accidentally disturbing the tesserae. I applied a ceramic pink circle on each cheek of the bunny, which I think will tie in nicely to the pink in the ears. And then I started applying pieces of a broken ceramic bowl around the neck of the bunny. Basically, the glass design going down the front of the bunny's body and then the broken ceramic bowl going around the neck creates the look that the bunny is wearing a coat. At least that's how it feels to me. Now I was ready to get started on tiling the body of the substrate. And for this, I'm using broken plates, bowls, and cups, plus a few back stamps. Now, as a reminder, the plates, bowls, and cups are a mix of white and off-white, and they're all in very subtle shades. There's no rhyme or reason in my tesserae placement. I'm trying to spread out the mix of white and off-white pieces, but I'm not going to stress it if 2 white pieces are next to each other or 2 off-white pieces are next to each other. I'm just tiling and enjoying myself. As I got further down the body of the bunny, I decided to take the bunny off of the pottery wheel and lay it on its side on my work table. I could have left the bunny up on the wheel if my chair was shorter and I was looking up at the substrate, but having it set up on this pottery wheel started to get uncomfortable for my back and neck, so what do? We adjust. And every so often I placed a back stamp amongst the pieces of plates, bowls, and cups. Now, as you may recall, when I showed you the back stamps I had cleaned up, I'm working with a mix of sizes and the letter printing on these pieces is in a variety of colors. From black, brown, red, green, blue, and metallic gold. And the background of these pieces is also white and off-white. So they all go together beautifully with my main materials of broken plates, bowls, and cups. The more I worked, the more I wished I had used more of the back stamps. They're adorable and addicting. And for those of you who are familiar with selvage when it comes to fabric, back stamps are pretty much the equivalent of that, and I love fabric selvage too. Now, some of the back stamps I picked out for this project ended up being too big no matter which direction I placed them, and that's okay, it happens. Thankfully, I did have others, so it really didn't matter. I decided to go with this adhesive because number 1, it's perfect for outdoor mosaics, but also number 2, I have a ton of it. And number 3, I went with white because I didn't want a dark adhesive like GROUT-THINSET or gray epoxy sculpt to darken my white and off-white tiles. So, although none of my materials are transparent, with some of them, there's a possibility that a dark gray adhesive could dull them down or slightly show through. So these are the reasons why I chose a white adhesive. Now, because this is a curved surface, each tessera could only be so long or so big depending on how I placed it. So let me give you an example. I could use a long, narrow tessera and place it vertically without much issue of the ends pointing out or off of the substrate. But in contrast, I probably couldn't use that same tessera if I placed it horizontally, because for sure the ends would point off or be off of the substrate, which could cause a hazard. You know, if I tried to pick up the bunny or somebody else tried to pick it up or wanted to touch it. And once I was done, I put the substrate back on the pottery wheel and checked to make sure everything was in place. Remember, the adhesive that I'm using is cement-based, so once it dries, it's really in place and very, very difficult to make changes to tesserae placement. So if you work with thinset and you're doing a tiling session and you're going to come back later and do another tiling session, clean up the extra thinset that has oozed out. Clean off that thinset from your substrate. You will be so happy that next time when you go to sit down to continue with your tiling. So next up, I'm going to finish off the head of the bunny, and I'll do that by continuing the rows of stained glass and vitreous glass tile. And now that the design is low enough, I can actually match up both sides of the bunny's head and bring the rows of glass tesserae around the back of the bunny. Next, I got to work with tiling the bunny's ears and opted to use the 1-inch white glass tile cut into random shaped pieces. There's a lot going on with this bunny besides just the mixed media aspect. There's an organized tiling pattern and a freestyle tiling pattern, and I like that both can equally coexist on this mosaic. A lot of that can be contributed to me using the same color palette for the entire mosaic. And once I was done with the first ear, I moved over onto the second ear and tiled it exactly the same way. And then once the ears were both done, the one thing left was the cute little tail. I'm using the same material as I used on the white part of the bunny's ears, which is the 1-inch white glass tile. And I started by cutting a small circle which will cover the tip of the bunny's tail. And I adhered that to the substrate using thinset. Next, I cut short, thin strips of the glass tile and placed them in between the tile work of the bunny's body and that piece, that round piece of glass tile that I just placed on the tail. I was going to leave the tail like this, but I decided I didn't like those openings on the tail, so I cut small triangles of the white glass tile and placed them between the thin short strips. And there's the bunny's little tail. So at this point, everything is tiled, and this figure will just sit here and dry fully before I move on to the grouting stage. So I'd like to bring something to your attention that I noticed when I was working with this substrate. Occasionally, I would accidentally hit or knock into the substrate with my wheeled glass nippers, and I noticed a bit of a hollow sound. And when I turned the substrate on its side to make tiling easier, I noticed that there are cracks on the bottom, which indicates that this may not have been poured into a mold, but rather it may be two different pieces. So although I didn't see any seams to speak of along the sides of the substrate, with this discovery, I no longer can assume that the entire substrate is cement. So one way to ensure everything stays in place and that it's appropriate for outdoor use was for me to cover the bottom with fortified thinset that I had been using as my adhesive throughout the tiling process. So this is easy to do. I just spread a thin coat of the thinset over the entire bottom of the substrate, making sure I covered all of the area. And now the bunny will sit and fully dry before I move on to the next step, which is grouting. And as I mentioned earlier, there will be a full list down below in the description, not only for the substrate that I used, but also any of the materials and adhesives that I can link, just in case you might want to make a mosaic garden bunny of your own. Okay, so the mosaic bunny has been sitting here drying for at least 48 hours, so now it's ready to be grouted. And for the grout, I'm not actually using grout. Instead, I'm going to once again use fortified thinset. Yes, you can use thinset to grout your mosaic art. And I want to mix up a custom color of thinset. I think a pale gray would be a nice contrast with all of the white and off-white tiles, but it wouldn't be too contrasting that it would take the attention away from my tile work. So I started mixing up my custom color by blending white and gray powder thinset, and I recorded it on my GROUT-THINSET recipe card. So this is important because I'd like to have a recipe for a good pale gray color for future grout and thinset when I need it, but also should my bunny get damaged, I've got the exact measurements of everything I used in order to recreate that color and repair the mosaic. So this GROUT-THINSET recipe card allows you to track 16 items regarding mixing up your grout or thinset, and it's especially handy if you're mixing up a custom color like what I am doing today. And if you'd like to learn more about it, there's a link down below in the description. So once my grout was mixed, I was ready to start grouting. And I started by smoothing grout onto the bunny's head. So whenever possible, I would go in a clockwise, counterclockwise motion, pushing the grout into the openings between the tesserae. In some areas, all I could do was rub back and forth or simply push the thinset into place because the area around the neck and the ears was so small. And once the head was grouted, I moved on to the body of the substrate. And I grouted in the same way of working the grout in a clockwise, counterclockwise motion. And if your mosaic is like mine, and you used pieces of broken plates, bowls, and cups, go slowly as you grout. I can already tell at this point that one of my gloves has a rip in it. I can feel that thinset on my skin. Although during the tiling process, I try to adhere the tesserae to be at the same level on the surface of the mosaic, I know it was pretty much impossible with some of the tesserae, but I wanted to use those pieces anyway. So that's why it's important to go slow, because some of those are going to be higher than others. Now, because I'm using thinset as my grout, I'm not wasting time because I know that thinset has a shorter working window than traditional grout. And if you've watched other tutorials here on my channel, then you know my thoughts on grouting. When you're grouting, that's not the time to take phone calls or multitask or whatever the case may be. You need to focus all of your attention on your mosaic because you want to make sure that you grout properly, but also that you remove all of the excess grout in a timely manner. Now, I'm not trying to be, a downer here or be a bossy boss, but there's no sense in spending so much time tiling your mosaic only to leave the grout on for too long and ruin your art. Nobody wants that. So when you grout, you need to carve out that time and devote your full attention and time to it. As you may have noticed as I've been grouting, that sometimes I had the bunny upright and then I laid it down on its side and continued grouting. So depending on how big your substrate is, you may or may not be able to turn it on its side. And the bigger it is, the heavier it will be. So if you lean your substrate on its side, keep in mind you'll be putting all of the weight of the substrate on a few tesserae where the substrate meets your work table or wherever it is that you're grouting. And if you aren't careful, that could cause those vulnerable tesserae to come loose. So you just want to be careful and mindful that if you lean your substrate on its side and you rest it on your work table, you want to be careful. Maybe you can put a towel under that area just to give it a little bit of cushion. And once I was done applying the grout, I let it sit for about 10 minutes before I started cleaning it off. Now, if your substrate is bigger, like we were just talking about, then you might not need to let it sit and dry because it's already been doing that as you grouted other areas of your mosaic. So if that's the case, start cleaning off the grout in the same place where you first applied it. I'm removing the grout in the same way as I put it on, usually in a clockwise, counterclockwise motion whenever possible. And I'm being careful when cleaning off the surface of the mosaic just in case any tiles have a sharp point, or like we were talking about, some might be higher than the surrounding tiles. The goal of removing grout is to clean off any excess within the grout line, but also on the tesserae. But you don't want to dig into the grout line. You want that grout line to be flush. Usually you want it to be flush with the top of your tesserae, the surface level of your tesserae. And I went back over the bunny a second time, cleaning off more grout, mostly from the surface area of the tesserae at this point. And I used a toothpick to clean out the grout in between the ears on the back of the bunny's head. And lastly, I went over the surface area with a chip brush, or you could use an old paintbrush, to remove any loose grout particles or dust. So now that the bunny is tiled and grouted, I wanted to go back over it and add a little detail to the bunny's face. So I cut a little pink nose from vitreous glass tile. And then I got out my scrap stained glass and found a piece that's a mix of purple and gray, but very muted, which I thought was perfect. And I cut out a couple really, really thin pieces to make the bunny's mouth. And I attached them to the bunny on top of the already tiled and grouted area, and I adhered them with thinset. I wanted to add whiskers as well, but I decided not to because if I put this outside in my garden, we sometimes have random peacocks and foxes and cats and dogs, and I didn't want them to either mess with the whiskers or get hurt or cut. And honestly, I don't think it needs whiskers. And the final step that I'll take to complete this garden figure is that once the grout is fully dry and cured, I'll seal it. And if you aren't familiar with how to seal mosaic art for outdoor use, I've done a video here on my channel all about that, and I'll include a link down below in the description. I mean, look at this thing! With a size like this, I could see it on a patio, like on a little table, or down on the ground next to maybe a trio of some flower pots. It could go on your Easter brunch table. That could be the centerpiece, or your coffee table. What a cute little substrate this is. Really, really. And I'm so excited that a bunny was my first garden figure on this channel. Say hello, we should name her. Or him, I guess. Rabbit Peter Cottontail. He's not Peter, okay? But if you guys have any name ideas, leave them down below in the comments, because we could name him. We could make it like a community project and name him. So, although if you guys think it should be a girl, make it a girl. I don't care. But let's give him or her a name. I love you guys. Thank you so much for joining me today. As always, I appreciate your support. As you can see, maybe from the subscriber numbers, we have passed 30,000 subscribers. thank you so much. I do appreciate your time. Every time you watch a video, every time you spend a little time with me, if you send me a message and you say how much my video helped you get started or get past a point, a challenge, maybe with tools or adhesives or whatever, I do appreciate all of your comments and your messages. Keep creating, my friends, and I'll meet you back here very soon. For more mosaic inspiration, check out one of these 2 videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye!